Join the team for daily coverage from the RHS Chelsea Flower Show 2017. All this week across BBC One and BBC Two.
This is BBC Two with further analysis following events in Manchester. We now join Andrew Neil with the Daily Politics.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Following Monday night's terrorist attack in Manchester, the UK terror threat level has been raised to its highest level of critical, meaning more attacks could be imminent. Military backup for the police will now be deployed to protect key sites, including Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. Election campaigning is suspended for a second day by all political parties. And for the next hour, we will be reporting on the aftermath of the Manchester attack. The bomber Salman Abedi killed 22 people and injured 64 when he blew himself up. Many of the injured are still in critical care. Police have arrested 3 men in Manchester this morning. The bomber's 23-year-old brother was arrested yesterday. Flowers have been laid and tributes have been paid to the 22 people killed in the attack at Manchester Arena. 8 of the victims are known to be Safi Rose Roussos, Olivia Campbell, Lisa Lees, Jane Tweddle Taylor, Martin Hett, John Atkinson, Georgina Callender and Kelly Brewster. The Polish Foreign Minister has said that a Polish couple who went missing after the attack are among those killed. Thousands of people turned out for the vigil in Manchester yesterday evening and to hold a minute's silence to remember those who died. Home Secretary Amber Rudd, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, Commons Speaker John Bercow stood on stage alongside Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham and Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable Ian Hopkins. This morning, members of the Cabinet met as the Prime Minister Theresa May again chaired COBRA. That's the government's Crisis Response Committee. And Chris Phillips, former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, he'll be with me throughout the day. Chris, welcome to the programme. The fallout from Manchester still dominating everything. This is obviously a huge security investigation now underway. Where are we at now?
Well, I think the most interesting point, the things that haven't come out yet, which are absolutely essential to know, is was this homemade explosive? Because if it was homemade explosive, then somewhere in the UK there's a bomb factory that needs to be found. And also, was the device actually strapped to the person, i.e. was it a suicide bomb or potentially was it a dropped case? And if it was a dropped case, then maybe this was designed to be the first of a number, in which case there are bombs still in the UK somewhere.
Because unlike 7/7, when they were backpacks, I think, that the bombs were detonated. They had them on their back. I've seen pictures, or at least mock-ups, recreations, suggesting that this suicide bomber had a suitcase.
I've seen exactly the same, and I don't know whether that's through fact or whether that's just someone's opinion. I haven't heard anything from the police yet, but it changes totally the way this investigation will go. It was quite obvious to me straight away that this was not just a one-man band that's done this. There must be a group behind it. But whether or not this person actually was going to drop her case and walk away, in which situation we would have potentially a number of other cases waiting to be dropped.
And we're going to go through all this in detail with you and others over the next hour. But it would seem, am I right in assuming that because, as you say, the security services now think this was not just a lone wolf operation, that he had help, and that help is still out there, that is why the security alert is now up at the highest critical level?
Yes, I said yesterday that if the level goes up to critical, then for sure they're chasing other people. And when you get a situation like this, if it's a homemade explosive, then there's absolutely no way that one person's going to do that. It takes
Is that right?
a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. You have to get the ingredients. You have to get the understanding of how to do it. And I don't think there's anything that says that this would have been a one-man band.
OK, we're going to go through a lot of that, Chris, in the next hour. Well, of course, what happened in Manchester is still dominating the news, both here and abroad. This morning's British newspapers all have pictures of the young victims on their front pages. The Sun's headline is Pure Evil, with a picture of that youngest victim, Safi Roussos, only 8, alongside the man who killed her, the suicide bomber Salman Abedi. The Guardian again has 8-year-old Safi and a picture of the first victim to be named, Georgina Calendar. The Daily Mail has the same 2 girls with the headline, Soldiers on the Streets. And the Times looks at the links that Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber, had with Libya. And we will look at that too in the next hour. The Telegraph looks at the raising of the terror threat level and reports that we will be seeing troops on the streets. And finally, the Mirror has the headline, simple headline, Killed by Evil. Well, last night the Prime Minister announced that the independent body, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, JTAC they call it in Whitehall, had decided to raise the terror level from severe to critical for the first time since June 2007. Let's take a look.
This morning I said that the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, the independent organisation responsible for setting the threat level on the basis of the intelligence available, was keeping the threat level under constant review. It has now concluded, on the basis of today's investigations, that the threat level should be increased, for the time being, from severe to critical. This means that their assessment is not only that an attack remains highly likely, but that a further attack may be imminent.
That was the Prime Minister last night. This morning, Home Secretary Amber Rudd gave more detail on what we can expect to see with this increased, highest threat level.
Good progress with the operation has been made with a number of arrests overnight, and that will continue. We have now gone to a critical level in terms of the threat. Operation Tempora has now been invoked, and that means that there will be additional military personnel coming to backfill the armed police officers so that they can support other areas. Today we have 984 members of the military coming forward as requested by the police. They will be initially deployed in London but also in the rest of the country as requested, and they will form an important part of the defence going forward.
That was the Home Secretary this morning. Let's take a look in more detail at what the new threat level means. Critical is the highest terrorist threat level that the UK can face. It's what we face now. As the Prime Minister said, it means that a further attack could be imminent in the view of security and police experts. We had previously been on the second highest threat level, which is called severe. Using the critical threat level is unusual. It's only been used twice before, once in 2006 and once in 2007. The Prime Minister said the police, as a result of moving to this level, had asked for military assistance in guarding key sites around the country. These locations include the House of Commons, Buckingham Palace and foreign embassies. It also means that the police will be given extra resources to deal with the critical threat level. Now, the terrorist threat level is set by the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, JTAC. It draws on expertise from security services and the police. The decision to deploy troops is for the government. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd stressed this morning that the critical threat level was a temporary arrangement to respond to what she called an exceptional event. Joining us now is Professor John Gearson from the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College here in London. Welcome to the programme. In practice, what does moving to critical mean?
Well, I think for government buildings and even public sector entities like universities and hospitals, there will be different security, more enhanced security. People will be called upon to identify themselves in a way that they might not in every single building. I think for the decision to deploy the military, this is outside that normal step up to severe. And in fact, that is something that is obviously going to attract comment.
Can I just clarify that? Because some people have assumed that because it went to critical, that then means the military is deployed. That's not the case, is it? These are two separate decisions. JTAC saying we need to move to critical, that's an independent decision. To then say we need to deploy troops, that's a government decision.
That's right, and I don't think the military deployment is actually necessarily linked to even going to critical. It could be chosen to be brought out to support severe level. The key thing is this has been driven not by, in my opinion, a long-term considered approach to this, but essentially a result of the Paris attacks. So this policy of being able to call upon the military is a profound change in the attitude of the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office.
Because as a result of the Paris attacks, we began to see more and more French military on the streets of French cities and infrastructure and so on.
Yes, Operation Sentinel in France is criticised by many. That they say that what's the meaning of an 18-month state of emergency with military on the streets? And I think we can see that as the high end of the use of the military. But Britain has been very reluctant to use the military for a variety of reasons, which we probably can't go into now. But I think an appropriate, cautious use of the military is appropriate in a time of national emergency. If we want to call this a national emergency, and by calling it critical, I think in the short term the government is saying, yes, this is something unusual.
But we have not designated this a national emergency officially, have we?
No, not at all. And that's why I think
unlike the French, President Hollande, the previous president, he did declare a state of emergency and extended that state of emergency.
That's right, and many people in the British counter-terrorism world thought this was a mistake. The British approach is predicated on normality, trying to signal to the public that yes, things may be dangerous, but normal life is going to continue. Now, on the other hand, when a suicide bomber, if it proves to be a suicide bomber, but let's assume it is, even if it's in a suitcase or whatever, if a suicide bomber kills 8, 9, 10-year-olds, that is not normality. So I can see why the government wants to respond. The question is whether the military do something useful rather than just be a presence on the streets.
But what do you think? Is the deployment of the military, is it more than just symbolic?
Well, I think it's disappointing, actually, because it tells a story that the police haven't got the resources to do the job that we want them to do. We want the police on the streets, and I think most police forces, certainly most of the officers that I speak to, would say the resources just aren't there to maintain the number of officers on the street, particularly with guns, because they do not have enough officers that can carry guns to cover all the locations for a sustained period of time. So that's why they need the military, and it's disappointing that we've got to that stage.
And it's your understanding too that it was the police that asked the government for the military to step up and help take the pressure off the armed guarding of sensitive sites?
I would imagine that is the case, because I think what the police want is actually the ability to respond. So that what that means is actually having the responders available right across the country, actually. And what we do know is that actually London has got a pretty good response to armed incidents. The rest of the country, not so much. And this has happened in the north west of the country. This has not happened in London. And constabularies in that area do not have the number of firearms officers that are available in London.
Now, you were saying earlier that this had gone to critical because it was clear that Abedi hadn't been operating on his own, in your view. If that's the case, that means in this police operation that's going on, they will be getting a wealth of detail, will they not? I mean, it's not becoming public, obviously, quite rightly, but there's a ton of stuff they're going to be across now.
Well, hopefully they've got some history of this guy, that they know who he is and who he's been playing with over the last 6 to 12 months.
It's not clear that they do, though, is it?
No, I think that's one of the issues here. And of course, we would expect them to keep this quiet at the moment, but at this moment, it doesn't appear. I would have expected to see quite a lot of arrests. And most crucially, the bomb factory, if this is a homemade explosive, that bomb factory is dangerous. It's something that when you make homemade explosives, it's extremely dangerous and volatile and can go bang at any moment. So the police will be wanting to get into that as quick as possible to make sure that other people are safe as well. And we'd see people being moved out of flats and houses and things to deal with that.
With what we know so far about Abedi and his Libyan parents and background there, what do you make of where we are? Was this man, would you think, on the security radar, or was he too low level as they thought to be on it?
I mean, I'm a sceptic about the concept of a lone wolf. Nobody is alone. Everybody is connected to somebody and has connections that leads to the point at which they carry out violent attacks. The picture coming out this morning in the press, and obviously it hasn't been confirmed by the government yet, is a bit conflicting. On the one hand, a device that needs more than basic amateurish mixing of chemicals in a pot in a room, and the desire to carry out a suicide attack. On the other hand, neighbours reporting his going into the streets and chanting prayers, growing a beard, doing the sort of operational security that no serious professional terrorist would do. They would be doing the opposite, you know, wearing Western clothes, not chanting. So I don't think we should ascribe a strategic brilliance to people possibly inspired by ISIL until we know for sure that they are connected.
But it is also the case, is it not, that to make a suicide bomb that works is actually quite difficult?
I mean, I think, you know, we saw on the 21st of July 2005 that just by getting the mixture wrong, the devices didn't work.
That was the one that they attempted follow-up after 7/7.
That's
the
right.
21st of that month.
And then we had the shooting of the Brazilian John Charles de Menendez during the pursuit of those 4 people, who, by the way, surrendered. They didn't go down fighting. Quite an interesting thing to remember about suicide bombings.
But we know that Abedi had just come back from Libya. We think his father is living there most of the time now in Tripoli. We don't know if he saw his father. We know, as you were saying, that he was chanting very loudly in Arabic, prayers and parts of the Quran. And I saw one report that said that there was a black flag flying from the garden with Arabic script on it. I mean, doesn't that alert anybody?
Well, let's hope so, because he's shown all the signs that should have been alerted. And one of the other things that I've read as well, that he's actually effectively, an imam has actually seen him and said, I'm very worried about this guy. Has that imam told the police? Have the neighbours told the police? Because whilst this stuff may be happening, someone has to tell the police, and that's the only way we can get involved. The police can get involved.
What do you make of it when you add that, what we know already, to it?
I mean, my speculative best instinct at the moment is that this individual did travel to Libya, did have contact with people who may well be in some way linked to Islamic State and may well have had some training. But he does not seem to display, as I say, the professional group terrorist that we would expect. So I think for the government, the key question is, are there more bombs, are there more people, or are there these slightly volatile individuals who may or may not have had some connection and some training and therefore the ability to do quite a lot of damage? Obviously.
Of course, French intelligence, I understand, is saying that he also went to Syria as well. So there is, he could have been, we don't know if he was trained in Libya. We don't know what the connections of his father was. There's been some reports. He fell out with the Gaddafi regime and left. That's why they ended up in Britain. We'll come on to that later in the programme too about him. But I want to ask you, so the Home Secretary said this morning that Salman Abedi, the suicide bomber, was known to the security services, quote, up to a point. What does that mean?
I think it probably means that he may have had contact with somebody who was on a watch list or who even may have been watched. Constantly, the security service and counter-terrorism command must make pretty tough judgments every day.
Indeed.
About going and asking for resources, as we've just discussed. If you want to monitor somebody, especially in the current era, the current climate of end-to-end encryption, we know that the attacker in Westminster was WhatsApping just before he drove his car across Westminster Bridge. Still, I don't believe, it's not in the public domain, but I don't believe we've got those messages yet. There's an ongoing discussion with the company behind that technology. The question is, do these people have the ability to be ahead of the security services, even with all the sophistication that we've got to bring?
Well, in this case, sadly, they did.
And although this is a terrible, tragic event, it doesn't necessarily indicate, I must say, an intelligence and security. Well, it's a failure of our counter-terrorism efforts that anybody ever gets through, but it's not necessarily a failure of intelligence. We don't want to go to, and I know it's a general point, but in East Germany, more than 50% of the population were informing on the other 48%, and there is that balance between over-securitizing our lives and therefore achieving what conventionally we say we don't want to, which is changing our normal life.
There were some reports that Abedi had links with this called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in the Manchester area. Indeed, that they were in Whaley Range, which is not far from where he lived in the Manchester area, the LIFG. That they had raised funds and that they'd even been connected tangentially with the Disbury Mosque. We don't know that, but that's what some reports say. But it's been described, this LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, in that area in Manchester, as a hotbed for Islamic State. People will be watching this, will be surprised that we know of hotbeds of Islamic State in this country and don't seem to have done much about it.
Well, absolutely. And certainly at this point, I mean, I think 10 years ago, I don't think anyone would have been that surprised that we had these groups operating with what was going on in society at the time. I think since the Islamic State has started acting as it has in Libya and has committed all these terrorist attacks, I would hope that we've got a little bit more information about them to deal with them.
Let me just ask you one final in broad terms. We've been through this before, and the French have been through it even more times in recent years as well. Does anything change as a result of this?
Well, we are stopping most attacks, but the truth is terrorism is not stopped by security services. Individual acts of terrorism are, and they're very important. We ultimately have to go through the community and the policy of countering what you may call countering violent extremism or countering extremism generally. That's the long term. But the resources don't go into that. The resources go into physical security and intelligence agencies.
But we say this every time, that we have to do this after an attack. And yet 22 people were killed and almost 60 badly injured in Manchester again.
It's about the hardest policy area you can have. It's about education, it's about community cohesion and determined people in other countries planning attacks against us. I think no country has found an answer to this. And more importantly, it's a dynamic problem. The mobilization of people going to Syria and Libya were different people to the 2,000 we were looking at a decade ago from Al-Qaeda. Some were the same, some have moved over, but essentially it is a very dramatic problem, also for countries like France.
Professor Grierson, thank you for being with us. Welcome. Now, leaders around the world have been quick to declare their solidarity with the UK following the attack. Here's Ellie with a summary of how the world responded.
In Paris, the lights turned off as a mark of respect. In New York, the Empire State Building, a skyline dimmed. And in Dubai, Geneva, Zagreb, and Belfast too. The international gestures matched with words of solidarity from world leaders and contempt for the terrorists.
I will call them from now on losers, because that's what they are. They're losers.
After phoning Theresa May, the French president walked to the British embassy to sign a book of condolence. In Berlin, Chancellor Merkel said Germany stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain.
Deutschland steht an ihrer Seite.
Other world leaders took to social media to send their support to Britain, while President Putin sent a telegram to the Prime Minister offering to increase counter-terrorism cooperation. Like many European capitals, the EU flew its flags at half-mast in Brussels. And in Australia, Prime Minister Turnbull captured the mood of many.
This is a direct and brutal attack on young people everywhere, on freedom everywhere.
Ariana Grande, the American singer whose concert it was in Manchester, has flown home, but not yet cancelled her London tour dates later this week. Meanwhile, many other musicians tweeted their thoughts, including Rihanna, who said Manchester was close to her heart and suggested the attack could have happened at one of her concerts. And the Oasis singer and celebrated Mancunian Liam Gallagher, who tweeted that he sent love and light to all the families involved. The world of sport paid tribute too. Manchester United held a minute's silence at their training session ahead of the Europa League Cup final in Stockholm tonight. One of their most famous former players, David Beckham, captured the mood with this tweet.
Ellie Price reporting there. Now, police in Manchester say 3 more arrests have been made this morning in connection with the attack. One man detained yesterday is still in custody. Catriona Renton is our correspondent. She's outside the Greater Manchester Police area. Let's go to her. Catriona, what can you tell us about the 3 arrests this morning?
Well, first of all, there's been a number of developments today, Andrew, and just to keep you up to date on that, the 3 men who were arrested this morning were arrested in South Manchester. Police had been issued with warrants. Now, we understand, of course, that they have been arrested in connection with this investigation. Another development, the 23-year-old man who was arrested yesterday, well, we can now confirm that he is the brother of 22-year-old Salman Abedi, who, of course, was the bomber that was identified yesterday. And let me bring you another statement from Greater Manchester Police, which has come in within the last half hour. They can say now that they are confident that they know who all of the people are who sadly lost their lives at the Manchester Arena. They say they've made contact with all of the families who are being supported by specialist officers, and they say that due to the number of victims, post-mortems are due to take 4 to 5 days, and then they will be in a position with the guidance of the coroner to be able to formally name the victims. Now, this investigation is very fast moving, of course. We've seen the developments that we've already talked about. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd said this morning that Salman Abedi was known to intelligence services up to a point. Now, that leaves, of course, a big question as to what extent was he known to intelligence services. We understand that he's been recently come back from Libya. Of course, he would have had his passport checked by the security services when he came back into the UK. And of course, we've also heard that he may have been known to American intelligence services also. Now, this investigation, the central point to it now is, was Salman Abedi acting alone? Police want to know this. This is their main priority, is to find out who, if anyone else, was involved and to track them down. Now, they say we understand that they need to know where the bomb was made, if there were other people involved perhaps in the design of the bomb, the making of the bomb, the armouring of the bomb, and if maybe there were others who were encouraging Salman Abedi and supporting him before he carried out that horrific attack on Monday night. Now, as I said, the police investigation here is fast moving, police working hard with the counter-terrorism network, and they have also thanked the people of Manchester, thanked them for their strength and their resilience over the past few days, and they say that they will need to carry on with this strength and resilience while they ensure that they can make this city safe once again.
All right, Catriona Renton outside the Greater Manchester Police building. Thank you for joining us there. Let's stay in Manchester now and go to Lucy Powell, an MP in the Manchester area. Lucy Powell, welcome to the programme. In your experience or knowledge, how serious is the problem of Islamist radicalisation in Manchester?
Well, I'm not sure that this is the right moment to totally go into that, because I don't even want to ascribe what has happened to the Islam faith, because most of my constituents who are Muslim would absolutely disassociate themselves from any act of violence or terror like this. And so, you know, I think we've got to be careful of that.
But I'm not ascribing it to them. I didn't say Islam, I said Islamist, which of course is different. And we learned that there are areas regarded as hotbeds of Islamic State in the Manchester area. Were you aware of that? Is that common knowledge in the city?
It's I think sometimes these things are given labels, areas. You know, certainly there was a media report recently about Moss Side, an area that I represent, as though that was somehow a hotbed of Islamic extremists. And actually, most of the evidence that was used in that article just did not stack up, because people were from far and wide across the Greater Manchester area, and the people that they were using to create that story, weren't there at the same time as one another. So I think we have to be very sort of careful, especially in these times, to start pitting community against community, about saying that certain areas or certain people or certain communities are somehow responsible when they are not. These are the acts of deranged individuals who have in my eyes, have nothing to do with humanity at all. How anyone who is a human being could possibly carry out these acts, I find incomprehensible. So I think it's really important in the face of these sorts of atrocities and this horrific terror attack in Manchester that we don't start pointing the finger in the wrong place and pitting community against community.
None of the questions I'm asking you involve pointing the finger at anybody. They're trying to get to the bottom of how this happened and who was behind
Absolutely.
it. Is there a realization, is that the feeling in Manchester, that Abedi was not acting alone, that there is a cell, a group of people who have helped him to do this, therefore making the situation all the more dangerous?
Well, that's what we are hearing, and obviously I'm not in a position to provide a commentary, and nor would I provide a running commentary on the operation that is underway, and trying to make sure that everybody associated with this heinous crime is found and brought to justice. And of course, when somebody does carry out an act like this, in a sense, it does break open that cell or that network that has hitherto remained under the radar of the security services. So inevitably they will, and I hope that they close all the associates down completely and identify them all and make sure they are brought to justice. But it is an ongoing investigation. But I do not recognise the description of areas of Manchester, parts of Manchester, being hotbeds of radicalisation at all.
All right, Lucy Powell in Manchester, thank you for joining us there. Now, police have named this 22-year-old Salman Abedi as the person suspected of carrying out the suicide attack at the Manchester Arena on Monday evening. So what do we know about him and how did he become radicalised? We're joined now by our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. Gordon, we know he's one of 4 children of Libyan migrants who had fled Gaddafi. He was a Manchester United supporter. He liked cricket. He had smoked cannabis. He made it to Salford University. He wasn't from a deprived background or anything like that. His father had fled the Gaddafi regime, we think, at one stage, but is now back in Tripoli. What else do we know on this as we try to put a picture together of the suicide bomber?
Well, it's the moment of radicalisation which investigators are looking for, trying to understand when exactly that took place. Because, as you said, it looks like a few years ago he was a relatively normal individual, football supporting and so on. But associates, people in the area, have said that more recently they did notice some kind of change in behaviour and some potential signs of what now it looks certain to have been radicalisation. The issue of travel is one that I understand police and security services are looking at very closely. The possibility that he had been in Libya recently, was that a place in which he'd been radicalised? There's also some possible reports of other travel as well, and that will be something they will be trying to understand. Was he radicalised there? Was he tasked there? Was he given training abroad? What kind of travel might there have been? There have also been reports from France that French officials think he might even have gone to Syria. Some of this is not yet confirmed, but that's certainly going to be a very key line of inquiry.
What about this group, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group? Now, that existed in Libya to oppose Gaddafi, though Gaddafi's security services pretty much closed it down and took out, killed a lot of the leaders of it. But there seemed to be a remnant of it in the Manchester area, and he may have had a connection. Do we have anything on that?
Well, the story of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, the LIFG, is a very interesting one when it comes to its relationship with Britain, because you can basically, it was a group which was Islamist in outlook, but was also anti-Gaddafi. And actually, if you look at the history, in the 90s, when Britain was very anti-Gaddafi, LIFG people found a home in Britain and were tended to be able to kind of operate here. Then after 2003 there was a deal with Colonel Gaddafi, and Britain and the Libyan regime suddenly became more friendly, and then there was more pressure on the LIFG in Britain. So there's this very interesting history over the last 20 or 30 years in which the British intelligence services and the state's attitude to LIFG has basically mirrored how friendly or not we were with the Gaddafi regime, which they were fighting and opposing.
And we haven't heard, I don't think, yet from the father, Abu Ismail. He was born in 1965, a very strict Muslim, but some reports saying he was also very anti-jihadi. I'd seen reports that he may have been involved with internal security in Libya at one stage, but then broke with Tripoli in 1991, may have been in Saudi Arabia for a while, then went to London in 1992, then Manchester, and had 4 children, but then went back to Tripoli in 2008, before the regime change.
Yeah, and that's an interesting timing, because a lot of people from LIFG and related groups did go back after regime change. There were some deals done with former opponents under Colonel Gaddafi in that period, but that does look quite unusual. Now you do have a lot of former anti-Gaddafi forces and individuals who are based and back in Libya. And so it's a very complicated mix, the Libyan opposition scene, full of different groups, different individuals, different factions who often have been fighting each other in recent months and years. And also that will complicate the intelligence and security gathering business for British intelligence to try and establish what the links are and who knew what.
Gordon, just one final question on more generally. Sum up for us, where do you see the state of the investigation so far into Abedi and those who may well have helped him?
Well, I think the crucial issue is where was that bomb constructed and by whom? I think the general view from the authorities is that it wasn't a straightforward device. It might have required some assistance from others, and that therefore they want to know, was there a bomb factory in the UK? Was there a bomb maker in the UK? Or did that take place overseas, and was some of the training and expertise provided there? That is vital to understand where the residual threat lies and how serious the situation might be in the UK. And that, because it's unresolved, is why the threat level has gone up to critical.
Gordon Correa, BBC security correspondent, thank you for joining us from Broadcasting House. Now, I'm joined by the former Community Secretary Hazel Blears, who helped run the PREVENT strategy under Labour, and Douglas Murray, Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. It's a foreign affairs think tank. Welcome to you both. Hazel Blears, we've heard the politicians say what they say after a terrible atrocity like this happens, and we step up security. And what is said is well said and well meant too. But does anything in the end ever change?
Well, it's inevitable, isn't it, that after an event like this, people will concentrate on the here and now, and that is this operation to bring people to justice, and that's to be expected. I actually want us to take a bit of a step back and to think about what is it that's going on in our country and around the world, where we've got a kind of supply chain of people coming through who are radicalised, and not just radicalised, but prepared to kill and kill themselves in the process. Now, at 7/7, that was the first time we'd ever experienced that in this country. There was a kind of sense of national shock that 3 young men brought up and educated in the British education system could actually set out on a murderous bombing mission. And it's happened again. And it's happened in
10 years later?
10 years later, a decade on. And it's happened in France and Belgium and Spain and around the world. And my concern is that we've done some good work in PREVENT and bringing communities together, and the Channel programme, with the de-radicalisation, but actually we haven't really tackled this ideology. And I went to see the David Cameron's task force that he set up, together with a Conservative colleague on a cross-party basis, and we gave them a paper, and it was really about saying, can we take apart this ideology of hating the West, of having a caliphate and a theocracy around the world, and being prepared to murder on the basis that if you die, you go to paradise. It's a threadbare, worthless ideology. And, we tackle Nazism, we tackle fascism, and we need the same determination, I think, to be able to tackle this ideology. Then we might be getting somewhere. But at the moment, I just don't think that we are marshalling our resources in the way that we ought to be. It is an existential threat.
Though in the end, we
need
only
to meet it.
defeated Nazism because of total war.
Indeed, and I wouldn't
really
be
the idea
advocating that at all.
It wasn't really the idea in the end. It was the total war that won. What lessons are we failing to learn?
Well, every imaginable one. We don't want to listen to what the extremists say. We don't want to believe that they mean what they say. We still seem to be, even after all of these years, in this strange cycle. Hazel quite rightly says we're not preparing to fight this ideology, but I mean, our politicians, I think, from all parties, are very reluctant to even name the ideology in question. There's a concerted effort after an attack like that on Monday night not to listen to what the sort of things that are said that would impel somebody to do something like that, to listen to what they say, what they mean. Last month, the national act of mourning in Westminster Abbey after the Westminster terrorist attacks, just down the road from here, the Dean of Westminster, on behalf of this nation, stood up in the pulpit of Westminster Abbey and said, "We may never know what would drive somebody to do this." Sorry, we do know. We know why somebody like Khaled Massoud did what he did on Westminster Bridge and outside the House of Parliament. We know why somebody like this young man did what he did on Monday night in Manchester. They keep telling us. It's just we don't want to listen.
So what is it? Is the Islamist ideology?
Yes, and many...
Don't we know that? Don't we recognise that?
No. And but particularly we don't want to recognise where it comes from.
Where does it come from?
It comes from the religion. It is the worst possible interpretation of the religion, but it comes from it. And we are very reluctant in our society to face up to that, because underneath all of this, there's something else happening. The politicians are talking about the technical issues to do with terrorism and security. But the publics of Europe, including the public in Britain, are thinking totally different things. They're thinking at the moment, for instance, how can it be that we may bring a couple of Libyans who may have suffered under Colonel Gaddafi into our country as asylum seekers, and maybe they're pro-Britain, maybe they're the most pro-British people ever, but maybe their child will turn up to a pop concert one night and blow a bunch of women.
But how would you ever know that?
We don't. This is the issue.
I'm not sure what the policy follows, that we shouldn't have let them in the first place.
The policy issue is, as I say, that the public are wondering whether this whole idea of mass migration, of the borderless world and all these sort of things is such a good idea. And I think the publics are coming to a different conclusion to the politicians. It's right we have the security questions, but we should also, as a country, be thinking about the deeper underlying things. And finally, if I may say so, when Hazel says we have to tackle this underlying ideology and fight it and so on, I agree. But we've got to appropriately designate the problem. And Hazel, you know, we still have...
All right, you need to let Hazel Blair speak.
No, I think we probably share some of the analysis, Douglas, but I'm a practical person. And what I've set out to do with the PREVENT programme was not simply to describe the problem. And I agree with you, it needs to be named. But the overwhelming majority of Muslim people would totally reject this ideology. And therefore, what we need to do is have a series of practical programmes. It's core to have education, and not just of the Muslim community, but of other faiths as well, to understand this, to have critical thinking so that you can challenge the ideas of the extremists, because they're very simple. They're actually very stupid as well.
Yes.
And if you're able to have the ammunition, if you like, bad word, but, you know, the arguments to use. But, Douglas, you know, it's all very well to have rhetoric. Rhetoric can really inflame the situation. You need a careful, measured view with a proper programme and properly resourced
Hazel,
as well.
Can I just say, the PREVENT programme is a prime example of this. I've had all sorts of criticism of PREVENT, as have you. But what is one of the unanimous issues with PREVENT? There is almost total pushback against the policy from day one, from the self-appointed leadership of the Muslim community. That is one of the overwhelming things with PREVENT. People say, I've got a problem with this bit, a problem with that bit. No. Most people that you hear from within the Muslim communities, there are terrific examples of people who stand out from this, are against having any policy. It's not they dislike a bit of the policy, they don't want the policy.
I disagree.
And your neighbour,
I disagree with you again.
All right, let Hazel Blair speak.
I disagree with you again, because what you're saying is that the people who are anti-PREVENT, if you like, are the majority voice. They might be the loudest, but they're not the majority of voice. There are a lot of good, decent people in the community, young people who've become...
But within the leadership,
they have become absolute stars, and when they get the opportunity of a leadership platform, they are amazing young people. Okay. Women in the same place. You can't just paint everybody with the same brush.
And I didn't do that.
Let me bring Chris, and you've been listening to this. It's quite hard to see what the policy response is to this. I mean, your job, you have to pick up the pieces, in a sense, of the failure of a political strategy, because it has led to terrorism. But I'm not quite sure what should we be doing to stop it becoming your problem?
Well, I think,
education.
I mean, what we've seen actually across Europe, and if you think back to the attackers from Paris, certainly one of them was able to go back to his location in Molenbeek, 100 metres from where he was born and brought up, and hide from the police. There is such a disconnect between the community and the police force, certainly in that country. Now, what we've got, perhaps, what we've seen today, perhaps, is something going on, not quite the same, but along those lines within Manchester. And I think for all of our sakes, we need to break down communities that see themselves as insular and not linked into the rest of the state.
I mean, you said education, but I bet he was educated. He went to Salford University. He was studying business management.
When I said education,
he wasn't some illiterate whose mind had been warped.
His mind clearly was warped.
But not because he wasn't educated.
No, but when I say education, I mean education literally from primary school, to be able to understand that this kind of extremism is not something that represents your faith. It's not something that you want to be involved with. So you can be educated, to a top level, but you can still be driven by this ideology.
But at their time, politicians have this great faith in education. At their time, the Germans were the best educated people in the world, and they ended up with Hitler.
Indeed, and that shows you the strength of an ideology, doesn't it?
It shows the strength of the ideology
Absolutely.
and the importance of countering it. But you can't counter it if you simply think that it is solvable by Hazel Blears or Amber Rudd or anyone else coming up with a counter ideology. These people believe they're acting in the name of their God, and they may not listen to a British minister or a former British minister. And we've got to have a line to them that breaks right through to the heart of their warped ideology.
What does that mean? And that's a metaphor. What does that mean? I want to find out what Douglas... I want to know what the policy response is, not the metaphor.
The first thing, if I may say so, the first thing is that politicians and others have to acknowledge that when these things happen, instead of we're learning from them, coming together and so on, we say, we didn't want this sort of thing to happen. We never wanted to get to this place where we had people, including first and second generation immigrants in this country, blowing people up at pop concerts. And there is no single way to deal with that, but I can tell you one of the worst ways to deal with is when people like, unfortunately, Andy Burnham, now the Mayor of Manchester, in campaign not only to scrap the prevent strategy, but not even suggesting something to go in its place. The current strategy is about the best strategy going. It has all sorts of flaws, but I'd much rather have it than people who believe we should have no strategy at all.
On that we are agreed, Douglas.
We are.
Then we shall come to an end. We've run out of time. Thank you. The Manchester attack happened 4 years to the day since Fusilier Lee Rigby was murdered by two extremists near his barracks in Woolwich in south-east London. And the last 2.5 years have seen yet more attacks as the so-called Islamic State has encouraged its supporters to launch strikes against European targets. Back in January 2015, a pair of masked men killed 12 people at the office of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo before killing 5 other people in and around Paris. Later that year, Paris was hit again. This time, a group of gunmen and suicide bombers attacked the Bataclan Concert Hall and other sites around the city, leaving 130 people dead. The next month, a lone attacker, inspired by so-called Islamic State, attempted to behead a passenger in the ticket hall at Leytonstone Tube Station in East London. Then, in March 2016, Brussels was hit by 3 bombs, 2 at its main airport and 1 at a metro station near the European Union's institutions. 31 people were killed. In July, as France celebrated its national holiday, Bastille Day, a truck mowed through a crowd of people on the Nice promenade in the south of France. 86 people, including many children and young people, died that night. In December, a similar attack saw a lorry drive into a crowd of people at a Christmas market in Berlin. 12 people were killed then. Then in March, 5 people were murdered when Khalid Massoud launched a car and knife attack here in the heart of Westminster. Less than a month later, a man carrying knives near Parliament was confronted by armed police and arrested on suspicion of terrorism offences. Now, to discuss more about the bomber in Manchester, Salman Abedi, I'm joined by Charlie Winter from the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism and Adam Dean from the Quilliam Foundation. Adam Dean, let me come to you first. When you see that litany of appalling terrorist attacks and what we know about Abedi in Manchester, what's the theme? What's the trend? What's the common denominator?
I think what we're seeing is the aftermath of 2 decades of Islamist ideology running amok. And we're seeing the effects of there not being a strong counter-narrative, and that young Muslims are taking on this ideology of Islamism and understanding it to be an authentic representation and acting upon it and thinking that they're actually serving God.
But is the lack of a counter-narrative, Charlie Winter, is that partly the fault of the Islamic community, that they haven't built a strong enough counter to the Islamist ideology?
I think it's important to keep in mind that it is a tiny, tiny minority of people that actually think that any of this stuff is a good idea. That actually
But it can cause so much pain.
Of course
and
it
death.
can, but we need to keep it.
So the
keep
size
in
of
mind.
it, in a way, doesn't matter if you can kill 22 innocent people at a pop concert.
Of course it doesn't. I mean, it's not to detract from the atrocity and the scale of the atrocity, but I think at the same time, when we're looking for a better way to challenge this, a better way to counter it, we need to recognise that it is a small number of people, and also
All right, so we recognise it's small, but what do we do about it?
Well, what I'm saying is that the community, we can look to the Muslim community and we can ask them to do more, but the fact of the matter is that people like Abedi don't listen to the Muslim community. There's only so far you can go with that line.
But you think that that's because there hasn't been a strong enough challenge to it?
I mean, ISIS is fringe, absolutely. But the problem here is that the Muslim community share a broad spectrum of beliefs with the likes of ISIS, with the likes of terrorists.
They share.
They share. And that's something that we need to be have a candid discussion about. And often these discussions about extremism, kind of medieval theology that supports these kind of acts are not being discussed. It's almost been muted, and it's time to have an honest discussion about these ideas.
Let me just be clear. You're saying that there are views within the mainstream Muslim community, which will be appalled with what happened in Manchester, but have something in common with Islamic State ideology.
Voids are there to be filled. If your Islamic education is one that talks about an Islamic state, a utopian Islamic state, talking about dividing the world in terms of good and evil, these ideas, these concepts can be exploited by Islamist extremists. And I think that is actually what's happening on the ground.
Charlie Winter?
I'd be a bit wary of saying that there is a large number of people, or I mean, perhaps I've misinterpreted it. I don't know, but I think that the vast majority of people would very much be very adamant in saying that they have no part of them believes in anything that the Islamic State does, and whether that's something which is kind of contradicted by a belief in the caliphate, ultimately being an important part of Islam, that's a different thing. But I think in this context it's important to keep very much in mind.
But are the mosques, are the Muslim leaders, is the Muslim community in general, because in the end they are the best people to do it, on the well-known principle that only Nixon could go to China. The best people to do this is the Muslim community itself, which abhors what is going on. Are they doing it enough to make sure that the kind of messages that clearly Abedi was getting to cause him to carry this out are not reaching people like him?
Well, the thing is, it's limited what they can do. An imam.
But are they doing what they can do?
Well, I mean, I think if we just go back to what I was going to say, an imam in Manchester who is moderate, mainstream, whatever you want to say, they will not be able to resonate with someone like Abedi. This is a world where a lot of the radical activity that used to happen in so-called radical mosques, that can happen very easily on social media.
If I could just come in here for a second. 99.9% of Muslims plus condemn ISIS. That's not the challenge. The challenge is to take on these ideas that give oxygen to extremist narratives. And in terms of mosques and imams, it's not so much what they're doing and what they're saying, it's what they're not saying. What we need to do is inculcate values, human rights, democracy, freedom, these kind of ideals in young Muslim minds so they can be inoculated from extremist narratives. That's what's not happening.
To what extent, though, even if we were to get this right, and I get the sense that we're a long way from getting it right, that it's closing the stable door after the horses bolted. I mean, we've learned that Abedi was in Libya. We think he might have been in Syria as well. We're told about 350 Islamic fighters who had been in Syria or Islamic State areas are back in the Manchester area. They've been radicalised. It's too late for them.
And I think the two multiplying factors, which we need to remember, is actually the ease of travel, which we've all got now and we all appreciate, and also the ease of communication, which means the very small 0.001% of the radicals, the idiots, can actually communicate and talk to each other and effectively multiply what they do. And of course, one terrorist attack is a huge issue across the world. And everyone now sees it. And of course, individuals can talk to other individuals and on the other side of the world, which was never possible, even a generation ago.
Is it going to get worse before it gets better?
I think so, yeah.
I agree. I think Pandora's box has been open.
Very well. We'll leave it there. Thank you both. Now, as we said right at the start, election campaigning is suspended for today by all political parties in the wake of the Manchester terror attack. But UKIP leader Paul Nuttall says he'll resume election campaigning tomorrow. We're not quite sure what the mainstream, the big parties, are going to do. Our political correspondent Norman Smith joins us now from Downing Street. Norman, where are we now in the restart of the campaign? Is there any sign of it yet?
Well, the only sign of it is UKIP going solo. In other words, they are going to start campaigning tomorrow with the launch of their manifesto on the grounds, says their leader Paul Nuttall, that not to do so would be a victory for the terrorists, that democracy cannot be put on hold. He says it cannot be cowed by a terrorist act. There will have been 2 days of non-campaigning as a mark of respect, and that tomorrow would be an appropriate time to start. I have to say, I think they will be doing so on their own. I detect no inclination from any of the other main parties to join them. The language from government is that they are talking about several more days before campaigning resumes. I presume that means probably stretching into the weekend. Who knows, you could even go beyond that, maybe even beyond the bank holiday Monday. I think the SNP are also beginning to calculate that their manifesto may have to wait for next week. In terms of Labour, they clearly would like to get on with it because I think they feel that they were building up a degree of momentum and that if there is any politics around this, it probably plays more to the advantage of the government. But that said, I don't think they will break ranks and suddenly start campaigning. So my expectation is UKIP will have their launch tomorrow. I think it will be hugely controversial, and I suspect most of the questions will not be about their manifesto, but about whether it is appropriate to restart the campaign when you've still got young people, children in hospital with very, very serious injuries. And of course, we've got a live counter-terrorism operation going on, and who knows, maybe a continuing terrorist threat.
Well, it sounds, Norman, from what you're saying, and I know we don't know for sure, but it sounds like the campaign proper may not begin again perhaps until Tuesday, which would mean in the middle of a general election, a whole week of campaigning was lost because of what happened in Manchester.
I think that is a possibility. I would just caution this, though, as I understand it, there has been no formal discussion or decision within government about exactly when to restart. And I think that in part is because of the nature of the counter-terrorism operation, the fact that the risk has now been raised to critical, the fact that troops are going to be deployed. There is clearly a nervousness and anxiety that this man Salman Abedi had associates, was maybe part of a network. In other words, there is a potential live threat. And I think any Prime Minister would be very wary about returning to an election campaign in that context. I do think there is also a respect factor and how the public would react to politicians, shouting the odds at each other if people are really in danger of losing their lives still, and if we've still got children in hospital. So I think they will err to play this long.
And indeed, Norman, thank you for that. And of course, that is a problem. Those who lost their lives, the names are still coming out. Some heartbreaking pictures of youngsters just starting out in life. I can see the difficulty for the politicians. I would think, given the abilities of our security services that we're going to see some breakthroughs in the next 48 to 72 hours.
Well, I really hope so, Andrew. And what I would say is that I honestly don't believe that we're at the beginning of this terrorist incident. Actually, you know, we've seen in other terrorist incidents lots of people holding up in flats, being arrested, bombs going off. So I think, unfortunately,
that could happen again.
Yes.
All right, Chris. Thank you very much. That is the end of this Daily Politics special on the Manchester terrorist attacks. News is over on BBC One. I'll be back here at noon tomorrow on BBC Two. Bye-bye.